Hello and welcome to ABiQ's webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa. Before we move on, we will be sharing the webinar, which is recorded, along with the slides to all those that registered. I'm delighted to have 6 panelists with me on this webinar today. And I think I will move on to introduce them. But before I do that, let me first just maybe lay out quickly what we'll do in the next hour. I'm going to introduce the panelists. They will have 90 seconds to introduce themselves, just give a bit of background and their involvement in Africa and how business continuity, how that is important for them. Then we'll go into the first point of conversation, which is the impact on business continuity, followed by the impact on delivery of infrastructure projects in Africa. So we'll probably have about 20 minutes to discuss each of these points. If you have any questions you would like to ask the panelists, please use the questions, the Q&A box on Zoom to ask those questions, and also indicate who you would like to answer that question. So without any further ado, I'm going to quickly introduce you to the 6 panelists, and then we'll go on to allow them some time to introduce themselves. So first off, we have Thabang Rakuna, who's a property economist down in South Africa. Second is Dan Klink, who is CEO of East Africa Power, and he's based in Rwanda. We've got Hugh Nkuchu, who's based in Cameroon. He is well-known BBC correspondent, amongst others. We have David Baxter in Washington, who is part of the PPP, the World Association PPP steering groups. As John Laurent, who's based in France, who's working with as an advisor with Ernst & Young. And then we have Andreas Cole, who's based in the UK, who's done a lot of work on projects across Africa, and has got some active interests in many of the African countries. So first of all, welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. And I'll hand over to Thabang for 90 seconds. Thabang, if you can, just to introduce yourself and give us a bit of background.
Okay. I am Thabang Rakuna. I'm an economist, a property economist by profession. That means I am straddled between 2 pillars: economics on the one hand, and property development and management on the other hand, with special interest in infrastructure development under the auspices of sustainable development. I bring to you in Africa the impeccable case-creating skills when it comes to policy development, which skills I've earned from working for 2 governments, namely the government of South Africa and the government of Lesotho, and as well as some on-the-job training in different parts of the world. That's my story.
Okay, thank you very much, Thabang. Next, we'll move on to Dan, who's based in Rwanda.
Good day, everyone. Pleasure to participate on this panel. As was introduced, I'm the Chief Executive Officer and founder for East African Power. I'm Canadian, but I've been based in Kigali, Rwanda for the past 10 years. Our team is here because we're really passionate about environmental sustainability and being able to achieve that through the development of utility scale, small scale hydro and solar power projects. So we're a team of 100 operating in 10 different countries with projects that are in development, construction, or operations. So we've seen a lot of these supply and demand shocks from COVID-19 ripple through the economy. So it's a pleasure to participate on this panel and share our experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. From here on, we'll move on to Hugh. If you can introduce yourself.
Thanks, Emil. Hi, guys. Hi, everybody. Hi, ladies. My name is Hugh. I am the founder of the Public Policy in Africa Initiative. It's a right think tank. We are the African think tank. I'm very passionate about public policy in general, economics. I'm very passionate about Africa development. So it's my pleasure to accept this opportunity by ABiQ to share with you today. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Hook. We'll move on to David, who's based out of Washington.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's David Baxter. I'm a South African by birth. I was born in Cape Town and lived most of my life in Africa. I have worked on public-private partnerships and sort of economic growth related to infrastructure in North Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, and East Africa. So I've got a flavor of all of the Africas. As we know, Africa isn't a country, it's a continent with many different divergent ways of life. I started my career as a professor at the University of Limpopo in the northern part of South Africa, worked for the Human Sciences Research Council. Then I moved to the United States, where I've worked with numerous international development agencies such as USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the World Bank, and many different organizations. But essentially I've become a practitioner and thought leader in the PPP world. And currently I am a steering committee member of the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Units and Professionals. And I love, eat, sleep, dream, walk, talk PPPs.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. Moving on to Jean-Laurent.
Yes, so hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Emile for organizing this event and giving us this opportunity to discuss COVID-19 and its impact on Africa. So just to give some background about myself, so I'm a senior consultant within the Transaction Services Department of EY here in France. So we basically work on due diligence for corporates and private equity firms so as to help them in their mergers and acquisitions operations. Prior to that, I had experience in management consulting and also financial audit. And in fact, I have a degree in economics, and I'm really passionate as well with economic development in Africa. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Jean-Laurent. And then last but not least, Andreas Cole, if you can take over and just introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Emile. Highly appreciate.
Oops, sounds like we lost him there a bit.
Unmute, back again.
There we go.
Yeah, is it working?
It's working, thank you.
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, great. Yes, I'm an independent consultant, and I've got over 20 years experience in civil construction, project finance, renewable energy, or general infrastructure. I sort of pretty much cut my teeth in the UK PFI market in the early 2000s on social and transportation infrastructure. And subsequently then refocused on Africa by working for a couple of years with Electra, which has exclusivity with Infraco Africa. Just the last 2 years, I've joined on part-time basis an indigenous organization in Pon near Tema in Ghana. And I'm leading there a small team of 5 people projects, focusing on projects mainly around CNI and solar PV. The organization itself has an assembly line to manufacture solar PV panels in Ghana. And we are servicing that market and using the panels also for our own projects as an EPC contractor. If I'm not in Ghana, then I'm helping the UNDP and the Central Africa Republic on rural electrification using small run-of-river hydro. And I also support the Shell Foundation on the reporting with USAID and their DFID energy access programs. So originally my skills come from engineering, but now I do very much management consulting around change management, innovation, helping corporates on the strategy and positioning. Thank you, Emile.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andreas. Right, so Before we kick off with the first round of discussions, I thought I'd try and put up maybe a couple of slides just to maybe provide some context in terms of what it is we are looking at. And so I'll be sharing just my screen with the PowerPoint, a couple of slides quickly. And I think we all can see my screen, correct? Looks like, all right. So moving on, just wanted to put things into context just in terms of Africa, in terms of what is it we're looking at. So Africa, the continent itself, 49 countries, 1.6 billion people, 2020 estimate, and a GDP of $2.8 trillion. Just as a benchmark there, looking at the USA, always good to benchmark at the number one. 330 million people, but $20.5 trillion GDP. What a stark contrast. We all know, and we're all looking at Africa, because we're all passionate about Africa, and we do realize the scale and scope of growth going forward. So one of the statements, just looking at some of the population forecasts, we can see by 2050, half of the world's working age population will be based in Africa, and that's daunting. How do you prepare any infrastructure to be able to manage such rapid expansion? So having said that, I'll move back and hand over to Thabang. Maybe Thabang, would you like me to keep the slides up for you initially, or would you like me to add them later on? Where's Thabang?
To begin with, the slide up here relates to business continuity. Here, reference is made to the SMME sector, and I've taken South Africa as a case in point. Why South Africa is a case in point? Because South Africa is an economy made up of two economies, that is the developed world and the least developed world. So you have got the best of both worlds. And point number two is South Africa. In South Africa, data is accessible, and over and above that, South Africa is a big brother economy. Most of the African states look up to Africa. It's a role model, so to speak. The COVID-19 has brought about government bringing in the stimulus packages or relief fund to try and assist both households and businesses in order to ride the wave of COVID-19. In this regard, we've seen very important strategies coming forth from government, which put together a team of economists. And this team of economists in South Africa, they came up with they suggested this relief fund, and so central bank has also come to the party in terms of trying to inject money into the economy through buying of government security. However, I strongly feel that I could add onto the list by bringing the important strategy, which is essentially important for generating the demand or boosting the demand. The strategy is known as the unbalanced growth strategy. This is divided into forward and backward linkages. Through this strategy, we analyze the contribution of each sector to the economy and analyze the quick win, the upstream and downstream opportunities, and devote resources to the quick wins for job creation. In this process, we are also analyzing the supply chain and infrastructure projects. And we know that for success of infrastructure projects, we've got our logistics business has to be an oiled machine. In this regard, we are encouraging investment in logistics business. And why prioritizing the SMEs, which is divided into formal and informal? The reason being the SME is the engine for growth. So in this case, loans are being made available to the SME. However, these loans have been met with negative statements in the sense that the criteria that has been brought forward seems too stringent for this company, particularly because in this SME sector, you find formal sector and the informal sector. And the informal sector has got some potential, so it can't be, taken for granted or left aside. My take is that, for instance, to make this fund accessible to these SMEs, the key determinant in this criteria should be the purpose of the loan, proof of identity, proof of business registration, as well as proof of assets. Those are the key components that I would take as a priority. I think the issue of compliance is secondary. All we've got to do is just make sure that these businesses get access to money with less hassle. Next slide.
Thank you, Tabang. So that's your first slide, just in terms of dealing with business continuity. Maybe wanted to add maybe a bit more context as well with the impact of COVID-19. Now, I mean, it's well reported in terms of number of cases. I think it's crossed 5 million today. And then, there's well over 300,000. But looking at Africa and the response, of African governments, the lockdowns that we've seen in South Africa were one of the first ones, I think, in Africa to go down that road. And we've seen, till date, the latest numbers I could get is only about, but there's 2,900 or just over 2,900 deaths in all of Africa. How do you put that into context in terms of, reactions, with the lockdowns and the impact on business in general in Africa? So maybe with that in mind, if we move on to Dan, you in Rwanda, maybe just how has this affected business in Rwanda, and how do you see it going forward?
Thanks, Emil, for the question. It's Rwanda and South Africa have acted a bit differently, and the numbers are very different also. Rwanda, as soon as we had the first case, the airport was shut down. There was a very strict measures that were put in place, very proactive, and ended up being pretty punitive for small, medium-sized businesses having to adapt to it. But in the end, I mean, we've only experienced 300 cases. 200 recoveries. There's 100 active cases, or 109. With the airport shut down, or one of the first ones in the region, it's one thing for Rwanda to make these types of movements. Of course, if Rwanda here and things get back to normal movement, things have started to open up. Of course, the same type of proactivity may or may not be happening with our neighbors. And so, of course, Rwanda is not exactly a port country. We're in the middle, and so certainly we're reliant on our neighbors for trade and for food. So the impacts here have been quite significant. There will be a significant drop, of course, in GDP growth. And I think that when you look at the type of response and that has been made on the political side, you see that there was very fast response from IMF and World Bank and from other partners to reward, I would say, the type of proactivity. So there has been relief measures that have been put in place. But in a greater context of things, I think we've seen the flags raise up to say, to put out this fire, to deal with this, we're going to need 100 billion across the continent. And of course, looking at the numbers as 100 billion might seem like a big number, but when you're looking at the capacity of the West and Europe to just hit the print button, we don't have the print button over here. So that being said, I don't think that this is a $1 billion issue. This is more like a $1 trillion issue over the next 10 years. And I think that the economies that are responding and creating a conducive regulatory environments to attract foreign direct investment should be the first ones receiving that type of capital. So when we look at day-to-day business here, there's a lot of hardships, and of course, it's great that Tabang was able to highlight the challenges experienced for SMEs. They represent what 80% of the jobs across the continent. They've faced a lot of challenges in the short term, but people are very optimistic about the medium and long term. It's not the end of the world. Across Africa is so resilient, and here the people are resilient. And I think that what response measures are put in place for this need to be green ones. And so some of the dialogue that has taken place is Africa needs its own version of a Marshall Plan. So if you look at the state of the global economy after World War II, you had a tremendous need for really robust measures. And I think that the type of impact that COVID-19 has had here is not about coming in and putting in a $100 billion Band-Aid. It's about a $1 trillion African Marshall Plan. And I think that's what people should get excited about, and that's what people should move towards. So that's from a number side, and certainly I have a biased opinion being in the renewable energy sector, but I do think that a focus needs to be placed on resilient green economies. Thank you.
Agree with that. I've actually seen some announcements this morning about renewables being rewarded, post-COVID, in terms of how do you kickstart economies. That should carry a focus. So I don't think you're alone in thinking that. It's clearly a theme globally. So on the back of that, let's move on to Hugh. You're based in Cameroon. Maybe you can shed a light in terms of how things are going in Cameroon at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Emil. I think in Cameroon, we are in a difficult situation because of the lockdown. And also, as you know, the government is not able financially to support small and medium-sized enterprises as maybe in the US. So there is a lockdown officially, but business are closed. But backdoor, they continue to sell because, like you know, we have a large percentage of small and medium-sized enterprise as solopreneur. We call them in Sub-Saharan Africa buy and seller. It's a term that's not familiar in the Western world, but that means you buy and you sell for the day, you make a profit for the day, and out of that profit, you make a living for the day. So it's quite difficult, lockdown situation, but also the hospital, we are not well equipped. Do you know that in Sub-Saharan Africa, we don't have a lot of elevators? So it's quite difficult for us to deal with this issue of COVID-19. But I want to touch base on the liquidity part. As regard liquidity, if you consider at the government level, for example, that 60% of Angola fiscal revenue is from oil. You also have, it's 65% actually of Nigeria fiscal revenue. And Nigeria have budgeted $57 a barrel for this year, and Angola have budgeted something similar, $55 a barrel. The last time I checked the barrel of Brent this morning, it was at $32.50. In other words, almost half what was expecting to be coming into government coffer won't be coming in. So this poses the problem of diversification of African economies. They are too much dependent on export. They are too much dependent on international aid. When you consider enterprise in Cameroon, you have drop in sales, and it's similar to Sub-Saharan Africa in general. Because of lockdown, the main concern of small and medium-sized enterprise in Cameroon is rent and salaries. Mainly rent though. Like I said, a large percentage of those small enterprises are solopreneurs. So the main concern is rent. So government can help financially, but they need to pay rent at the end of the month. So it's a kind of difficult situation. That's why during the lockdown, most of them was selling stuff backdoor. Another concern that small enterprises have in Cameroon is the problem of tax. You know, the tax system is based on capital, not on income. In other words, whether you make profit or loss as a small enterprise, you need to pay tax. Usually it's a lump sum based on the categories to which you belong. So this kind of exacerbates the situation and make it difficult for small enterprises in Africa and in Cameroon in particular. At the household level, though, our main difficulties in Cameroon concern remittances flow. You know, when I speak about remittances flow, I speak about it and I have some kind of, I'm very sad because, as you know, Africa, or South Africa and Cameroon, Mali, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire, we depend a lot from remittance flow from overseas. You know, diaspora, African diaspora work overseas and send money. You know, average number of poor people living in extreme poverty is 4 out of 10 in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, because of remittance flow, we don't have 5 or 6 out of 10 people living in extreme poverty. So remittance flow from overseas help a lot. According to a World Bank report, those remittance flow will be dropped by 23.1% because of COVID-19. So this is a huge blow to household in Cameroon and household in Sub-Saharan Africa in general. I will stop right there as far as liquidity is concerned. Maybe when we touch on SME, I will say more. Thank you, Emil.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I appreciate that. Moving over to David. Here we go, David. You there, David?
Yes.
There we go. Right. So if you maybe take a view on that continuity, I think Hugh is touch the liquidity issue, because I think you've got some very relevant parts to that. I'll share your slides for you. Just bring them up. There we go. There we go. All right, I hope you can see that. There we go.
Okay, so this, as we've heard from the different speakers, this issue is really prevalent right across the whole of Africa. And just in the last few weeks, I've had a number of high-ranking government officials, especially, you know, those involved in the PPP sector, reaching out to me and sharing their concerns and ideas. And I just thought this would be a good thing to ground the, you know, the arguments or the discussions, you know. And one thing here you can see, the first was, you know, they said the financial situation is worrying. It was really bad before Corona, and now it's worse. And you can read there, there's no money, everyone is exhausted, there's no borrowing capacity, no taxes coming in. What can we do to survive, and do you have any suggestions? Recently, I wrote an article on LinkedIn, you can see it if you do wish, on the need for COVID-19 triage and then recovery strategy for national PPP initiatives, where I recommended that government should consider sort of a triage action. And this is kind of the approach that's used when there's a medical emergency and people arrive at hospitals en masse, and you have to decide who can be saved, who can be helped, etc., who needs the most attention. And I think this is what's going to be important, not just in the public-private partner sector, but in all sectors, that it makes no sense that we throw money at industries that are poor, you know, that drain resources, etc. And I think this is going to result in a whole new way of looking at sustainability, as Andreas said, I think it was, and we need to look at sustainability, resilience, etc. I got the response also back, but it says, yeah, the challenge is that we face that there's literally zero money to go to even the red part of a triage, which means, you know, let's identify who can be helped at any cost. So, you know, the question is, you know, what are we going to do? Another practitioner wrote back to me, and this was sort of a solution suggestion that I thought was interesting, that, you know, often economic recovery or economic activities are burdened by bureaucracy, which can be too regulatory and, you know, is more focused on geopolitical concerns, bad neighbors, bad friends, I'm not going to help anyone else, not in my backyard. And, you know, there are more physical barriers up to prevent support or change than actually help things move forward. And the person then wrote also that we are in a TINA situation. There is no alternative situation and there's no time to waste. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think we're looking at a situation where we have to make strategic and dramatic decisions, maybe often in a data gap, because we really don't know how many people have COVID. We really don't know the impacts. But I think what is important that we will need to look at recalibrating economies with the aspects of sustainability, resilience, and regenerative approaches. And regenerative, I mean activities and economic activities and building infrastructure that rebuild themselves constantly and are not constantly reliant on handouts. And then the last thing I would want to say there, that partnerships between the public and private sector are critical at this time. The reason for this being is that the public sector doesn't have enough resources, the private sector doesn't have enough resources, but if they can harmonize their activities and get together in a pragmatic way, without biases towards one another, I think they can leverage their resources to help accelerate recovery.
Thank you very much, David. So let's just move on to Jean-Laurent. Your take on this?
Yes, sure. So my take, Emile, is that, and the argument that I will try to develop is that COVID-19 has been the trigger of a crisis, but how deep the crisis is going to be will depend really on the pre-existing conditions. So let me walk you through some sectors in Africa. So the IMF has forecasted that the growth for this year will be minus 5.2%. And we know that the consensus is that it's probably going to be worse. And when you look at the countries individually, for instance, you mentioned the oil exporters, such as Nigeria. I think that the countries which rely heavily on oil exports are going to be hit more, whereas some countries like Kenya, who are oil importers, are going to be thriving in this environment, or at least will be less hit. The second aspect is the tourism sector. You know, in my home country, Mauritius, we depend really a lot on the tourism, and we are going to be really severely hit. So this is why some governments, such as Morocco, are trying to develop local tourism. The third aspect that I would like to touch is on public debt. You know, between 2010 and 2018, the level of debt to GDP ratio has doubled for many countries. And in fact, the countries whose debt has really gone up in these recent years are going to have more problems to have fiscal space in order to do, you know, fund relief, to do wage assistance, etc. So I think that what I want to stress here is that the pre-existing conditions within the countries are really going to determine the way in which countries are going to get back on track. So now, if I talk a bit about, you know, the financial sector, because I work in the financial sector, I think that it's a hard time for Africa, because there has been a $4.2 billion outflow so far. So why? Because investors from Europe, from the United States are really getting their capital back to their countries to fight against the crisis. And so this is going to be a hard time for private equity investors, for SMEs which wanted to raise debt or raise equity. And another aspect is that there's going to be a mismatch between the prices, between companies which want to sell and firms which want to buy. So there is going to be some fight to adjust the prices. But it will also be, and that will be my last point, an opportunity. You know, there's a lot of dry powder, that is money which has been raised prior to the crisis, which is still here. For instance, you know, I think Emile and David, this will speak a lot to you. There's the South African PE firm Agile, which said that it has 900 million rand to invest. So I think that, as I said, the companies which prior to the crisis were solid, were strong, and which are able to navigate the crisis will be good targets for these private equity firms. So to conclude, I will say that, you know, this crisis is going to be hard for every for all countries, but those which had fiscal discipline, which had a diversified economy, a strong welfare state, are going to get on track quicker. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jean-Laurent. Andreas, the back of the queue. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, for me, I actually just want to build on what Dan was saying, but more on a SME, smaller type basis, because I left Ghana in the third week of March when everybody started to shut down, and the UK also made moves to close their airports, even though we are still, Heathrow is still serving across the world. But the feedback I have with obviously staying in touch on a regular basis with my team is that it's just translating the government guidance into practical matters for the SMEs are quite problematic. So for instance, the company I'm working for, just getting the people to work, getting them to change their habits. So there's a lot of, as you know, in Africa, a lot of buses which transport people along highways or major artery routes. How do these need to behave? In our industry, Dan, in mind, with renewables, you work to some extent close with each other on construction sites as well as in offices. And how do you change this, and how do you make people aware of it? So there is this fear or this concern that you're doing something, you're moving maybe too quick as the private sector, and you're not complying with public regulation, which hasn't been clear on a lot of things like office layouts and just commuting to work and working on construction sites. So Ghana in itself has opened up internally, so you can travel between Tema and Accra and Kumasi, but there is no traffic coming in from the outside. Goods are still coming in by plane and port, but no people movement. So the cases are going up, and obviously the monitoring or the tracing of the cases is a big problem. There's been just recently another case in Tema where they did a testing in a factory, and half of the factory people, which is about 1,700 people, were infected. So it's that kind of environment where the private sector is sort of tiptoeing around. We still want to conclude the projects which have been sort of stalled in the beginning, and we want to finish off the solutions. But also on the business development side, it is very difficult to make new contact, having particularly in the African context, the personal contact relationship you have with your clients is very important. So finding ways of having Zoom meetings or over the phone is very difficult.
Indeed.
So thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. I think we're not going to have enough time to go into more details on some of these topics, but I think definitely for our next episode we want to look at the response on governments and response. Was it a bit of a knee-jerk reaction? Was it overreacted? Because the problem is the data is not reliable, and also unless you do 100% testing, it's difficult to make decisions on data that we have at the moment. But anyway, so yeah, I think we want to go into on the project side to look at what are the implications, long, medium, short term, for delivering projects as a result of what's happened. And I think liquidity is going to be one of the big discussion points here. So I'll use the same sequence. I'll go back again to Tabang, and I'll put your slide up as well, Tabang. Can you hear me, Tabang? You there?
Yes, I can hear you.
There you go. Okay, I'll just share your slide. You ready to go, Tabang?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
Right.
Yeah, the topic is sustainability, resilience, and government policy going forward in implementation of infrastructure projects. When the COVID-19 started, most governments, South Africa included, were hit with a lot of panic, and we seemed to prioritize basic health over the economy. And this has affected the economy in a very bad way. So now, the economy is starting to open up. However, we're still looking at the emergencies, or the so-called essential services, and which is not really helping much in terms of the fragile economy that we're already having going into this pandemic. In this case, we've seen a lot of ambiguity in terms of policy as well as regulations, which tend not to be policy and evidence-based. I believe in this regard we can do better, because what we see is a blanket approach. We are not paying attention to our African economic and cultural setting, which is characterized by limited social security, contrary to the developed world. We know that in Africa, it's a daily hustle. Families cannot afford to be locked down, even as well as business cannot afford to be locked down. Otherwise, we are running at the risk of experiencing famine, which will take years to retrace. So in this regard, I strongly believe that continuity in terms of implementation of public investment as a catalyst for local development is key. And we also need to declare construction sector as an essential service. Why a construction sector? Because the construction sector is a multiplier effect in stimulating the economy and boosting the GDP. Because from the construction sector, you get short-term jobs to medium-term, and these are important for creating jobs which are badly needed at the moment. And one other aspect is housing, which has been left lagging behind. The COVID-19 pandemic has also brought about the urgent need for housing in terms of implementing the social distancing plan. So I believe that housing, in the same way, should be brought up as the urgent national priority in response to COVID-19. In this regard, we must also, I strongly believe that we must also embrace innovative building methods for which are cost-effective and for time-constrained reasons that we are faced with. This implies that there should be a paradigm shift from our traditional brick and mortar, which takes a bit of time and is a bit costly under these conditions of limited emergency budget. This innovative building system, building methods are not new. They are already implemented in the developed world. It's just a matter of finding the middle ground and getting a buy-in for the general public to accept it. For instance, in this regard, we've seen the private sector come to the party in terms of assisting, particularly in Johannesburg, here in Johannesburg, with some of these temporary housing made up of this innovative building methods. And this has received this has been positively received. For instance, there's one case here in Johannesburg where this innovative building method has been targeted towards informal settlement, because this is where the scourge of the risk of pandemic, the pandemic is really dire in terms of cross infection. So in this regard, I strongly believe that we should embrace public-private partnerships, which in South Africa at this stage we see 2% contribution from the private sector, contrary to the contribution of 50% as seen in the UK.
So on that note, I'm going to ask if we can move on as well, because we've been running behind on time.
Okay.
Can we move on to Dan as well, just in terms of perspective of delivery projects in Rwanda?
I'm sure, very happy to talk about Rwanda, but in general, I think for independent power producers, the demand and supply side shocks have been quite significant. And Rwanda operates within the East African Power Pool. And of course, when you look at Rwanda's trajectory, well, maybe 5 years ago was 60 to 70% dependent on Greco diesel power for its economy. Today, it's reached about 225 megawatts of installed capacity, which is quite small compared to its neighbors. But of course, we're looking at demand that is at 150 and was projected to kind of grow to 300 to 400. And of course, the objectives in Rwanda was to reach universal access to electricity in the next 5 years. Of course, that's going to have a very significant impact with just the inability to reach the people and get back to work. In general, on the demand side shock, we look at East Africa in general, and within the East African Power Pool, where you almost have 2,000 megawatts of excess supply already in the market. I mean, when the industries and the manufacturing is not taking place, there's a significant pullback and challenges for the utility. They have no one to sell power to. That being said, of course, this will take to David's piece about people reading which to triage what's in the supply pipeline. But of course, I think that this draws into question the need that there's still significant demand within the East African Power Pool, but a lot of it's trapped. So the work that's needed to integrate not only the East African Power Pool, but the Southern African Power Pool and the Western African Power Pool is even more important now, as it's very difficult for these utilities from the liquidity side. So it's challenging for the governments, it's challenging for the utilities, it's challenging for the consumers. And if you look at across the continent, only 2 out of 55 countries actually have utilities that operate in the black, meaning that there's a continued dependence on the state for that cash to operate. So in a situation like now, when they're actually producing more and can produce more power than where there's demand, the impact is quite significant. If we look at the access to electricity agenda 2030 to hit 573 million people to be reached through that are still unelectrified, the task is tremendous. The short-term impact is really significant. Medium term, things can bounce back, but there's been a lot of talk and very little walk. So a lot needs to be done if there's going to be a resilient recovery from this. And so the numbers look like there's supposed to be 200 million to reach power through grid extensions. And there's been significant investments on the generation side, but lack of so on the distribution side. 200 million hopefully being hit with microgrids. I mean, those companies are suffering significantly just even to make a profitable business model out of selling power to those that have the least purchasing power, and 200 million to be reached with solar home systems. So if we look at the demand side of power, the impact's quite significant. On the supply side, which is our business in East African Power, we really look at the different impact, and of course, as Jean-Laurent was saying, like what pre-existing conditions existed before where that supply and demand will be impacted. So that impact is not only on a kind of country by country basis, but also there'll be an impact on which technologies are going to be adopted. Of course, there's less risk on maybe the solar in what Andreas is doing on the solar battery side as to the maybe longer term plans on the hydropower geothermal. So there'll likely be an impact there. And of course, alongside the value chain, what was brought up by Tabang was a need for the construction industry. But I think if you look at the development and the financing stages of the value chain, those are going to be most significantly impacted. What we see in maybe the construction or operation side is more physical distancing, maybe a slight increase in management costs. But that's the supply and demand side for the energy. I think really so much of this comes back to the liquidity to get these projects done. There's the big elephant in the room is where's this capital going to come from? And is it going to come from the Belt and Road Initiative, or is it going to come from the West and Europe? And there's different price tags, and there's different strings attached to that. And I think that's a value part of the dialogue about which projects are going to go forward, which ones aren't, and in which time period. So,
all interesting times and interesting topics and subjects to get into at a later stage. Thanks a lot, Dan. Moving on to Hugh.
Well, I just want to highlight the fact that in Africa, single large organizations are badly hit by COVID-19 as much as small and medium-sized enterprises. For example, there's a recent survey that suggests that the top 250 Africa companies' market capitalization because of COVID-19 will drop by 18%. So the impact on infrastructure of COVID-19, you can see it at two levels. The first one is the supply of key infrastructure materials because of transport and logistic disruption, like crane. We import a large percentage of crane that we use for construction. Also, if you take the example of Ethiopia, for example, over the last 10 years, they achieved an average GDP growth of 9.9%. In large part because of infrastructure investment, public investment into infrastructure, specifically construction sector. And this construction investment is financed by China to a large percentage. Direct loan by China to Ethiopia is about 20% of GDP of Ethiopia. Now, because China industry sector is in a recession, so we expect, or it's fair to suppose that the China investment toward Ethiopia will also decrease, and therefore infrastructure investment in Ethiopia will decrease. You take the example of Rwanda, for example, over the last 10 years, they achieved a GDP growth of 7.5%, also in large part due to infrastructure investments. And if you look at the budget, the state budget of Rwanda, you will notice that between 30 to 40% is support by international aid. So the problem I'm trying to say is because the US is the first shareholder of the World Bank, and the US now is having difficulty with its own economy, so maybe the contribution to the World Bank, the international aid will decrease because it's a function of the national income. So we see that Africa infrastructure investments is highly dependent on international aid and direct loan from China, from World Banks. So the problem now that I'm trying to highlighting and coming to the solutions is that Africa economy must definitely, let me say, should definitely diversify the economy. And when I speak of diversification, I'm talking about food manufacturing because the demand for food in Africa is $1 trillion. So there is a demand for food manufacturing because Africa still imports a large percentage of the food. Another solution that can be brought in very quickly is to provide every young people in Africa with a computer and access to internet. When I speak of young people, I speak people aged 25 years below. That is 60% of Africa population. The reason is because there will be, within a very short period of time, to counter the effect of COVID-19, a significant flow into the stock of critical skills. And when we speak about critical skills, we speak about improvement of human capital and therefore productivity. Some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, average productivity over the last 10 years was 0%. In other words, for the last 10 years, we haven't been productive. So it's important that we diversify economy by focusing on agriculture, food manufacturing, and provide every young people with one computer and access to the internet. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Hoek. I think it's very relevant. Moving on quickly, we only have about 10 minutes left or less than. So Jean-Laurent, sorry, David, you're up next, yes. David, sorry. And David, I'll put up your slide quickly.
So what I'm trying to, look at in the research I'm doing and people I'm interacting with are short, medium, and long-term impacts on delivering infrastructure, and then maybe looking more instead of, what are the impacts? We know they're bad. Everyone knows it's terrible. It seems a bit crazy at the time to be focused on the impacts when we should actually maybe looking at recovery strategies. So I just want to point out a number here. I'm not going to go through them all in detail because we don't have the time, but this will be the slide would be available, or you can reach out to me. But one of the things is we need to do a triage on projects, and those which were moribund, badly functioning, etc., and really serve no purpose to improving economic growth should, I think, be not supported. I think it's also important that we should consider appointing national ombudsmen who are independent, who can look at how we can, work forward on where money should be spent. I think the question of force majeure is going to be really important in projects. Who's blamed, who's responsible for these events that are out of control of everyone, because no one really did anything wrong, but they were an act of, often referred to as an act of God. Strategic PPP projects and large infrastructure should not be allowed to fail, because if they fail, the restart and the reconstruction would just be horrendous and a waste of resources. I think, we need to really understand what the impacts on projects are before we make rescue decisions. Many of the speakers have talked about regenerative sustainability. I think this is important. We need to also commit to building resilient infrastructure projects in the future, because events like COVID-19 are going to repeat themselves. And COVID-19, unfortunately, has taken away the focus on events such as global climate change and other events, and we still have to address those. I think it's important to future-proof projects. So these are projects that are well-structured, that can withstand future impacts. We need to also consider value for money. And there's a new initiative in the PPP world to really focus on people first PPP projects, where you look at the people and are these projects needed. There will have to be a recalibration of countries' sustainable development goals. I think what everyone committed to 5 months ago is now irrelevant, and there's going to be new sustainability goals. We also need to address the challenges of landlocked countries like Lesotho, Rwanda, which are now basically being held hostage by their neighbors. And then I think we need to provide incentives to the private sector, which are going to promote companies that are interested, especially in the private sector, to build infrastructure that will help economies recover. For example, such as tax holidays. And the SPLT MTs that I put on the end of those are what I consider short-term, long-term, and medium-term.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Moving on to Jean-Laurent.
Yes, so Emile, I think as we are running out of time, I will really just address one topic, which Dan has raised, which is where do we get the money from? So I will try to show you a paradox, In fact, if we look at the total asset under management in the world, it's $100.7 trillion, okay? And on the other side, the infrastructure financing gap from now to 2040, according to the Global Infrastructure Initiative, is $1.7 trillion. So, speaking again about the supply versus demand, there is actually more capital available than projects available. But what we are seeing is that capital is not being deployed to finance these infrastructures. And so why does that happen? So it happens because in Africa we have, of course, every country is different, but we have a certain number of risks which is preventing these projects from being financed. For instance, we have a credit risk. You know, we have a lot of default. We know that less than 10% of projects which are under consideration achieve actually financial closing. We have a currency risk. You know, even the rand, the South African rand, is really volatile. So not to mention in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwean dollars. We have risk on operation, you know, sometimes because of corruption, which has a high cost, projects are not given to the best suppliers. And so all these effects are having a negative impact on the capital, which is being deployed on the African continent. So to tackle that, I will recommend really to have a better planning, to have a national framework where we integrate the sustainable development goal, the environmental and social governance goals, so that we really align with what institutional investors are looking for. We have to provide more data so that these investors, such as Meridiam, for instance, which is a big African infrastructure fund, which focuses a lot of SDGs and ESGs, in order to attract these funds, we have to make sure that we are really at the international standards. So this will be really my last point, and I thank you for the speech time.
Jean-Laurent, thank you very much. Moving on to Andreas.
Yes, thanks. I also just keep it short because of the time overrun we already have. I think you will see more and more coming on this, looking about the supply chain, you will see more and more African countries trying to bring in the supply chain into Africa, not only because of the talk about bringing in manufacturing into the country, but now even mitigating future events like this COVID, which just happened. So the company I work for, they started already many years ago with bringing in assembly line for PV solar panels. They didn't see this as a rocket science, and you can see this already across the continent. I think I read articles that there is now in Kenya a company thinking of putting up shop in Morocco and North Africa, people bringing in this. So even though the panel costs are going down, there is still an opportunity to manufacture locally and be present. And when the global supply chain breaks, you're just around the corner, you hop on the truck and you get it. I can compare to Dan now more from the solar PV side because I've been heavily involved there. So I think, and because of the flexibility and the versatility of solar, by not only doing IPPs, but doing CNI, but also doing SHS, as Dan was mentioning, but also just products that you can just run a fridge or a TV off of solar panels, with Bbox being out there and promoting those products. The versatility of the solar PV and now battery, as also Dan was mentioning, coming into more and more affordable and also accessible in the African context. The supply chain will come more and more into the continent and make it more resilient in that. So the SME side will try and avoid future breakdowns in that.
Excellent. Andreas, thank you very much. I think I do agree with a lot of what was said today as well. I think COVID-19 has obviously brought a lot of negative aspects, but also identified a lot of, like you said, healthcare flaws in the healthcare system, inadequate service providing, and so on. But it also highlighted a lot of opportunities, and I think the supply chain, global supply chain, is definitely one of them. Where we've seen times where so many of Europe's factories relied on one single point to supply them with parts, to produce. And I think it's up to African governments to take this opportunity and pitch a case to Europe and the US and everywhere else where there's we've got the young population. We need to invest in education and we need to invest in the infrastructure. But the opportunity is there. And how do we make best of that? Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. We have run over by about 5 minutes already. We will share the few slides along with a link to this webinar hopefully by tomorrow. We've had 3 or so questions as well. I think what I'll do is, we know who they are attended to. I will send them through email. If you could maybe just reply, and we can provide that as part of the package we send out, so we can provide a bit more context to that as well. Hopefully we will do this again in a month, the webinar, but I would really like to have you guys participate in one of our webinars in the future. But I just wanted to say thank you very much, and all the best, and take care, stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.